are innumerable ways to be an adult, and the Owl House makes a point to show this to a younger audience. It's not unique in showing a multi-generational cast, but what makes it special in that regard is that it's a show targeted towards young audiences living in an era of increased social fragmentation, where intergenerational friendships and relationships are becoming rarer and rarer. This is a state of affairs that really only benefits the worst kind of adults, specifically because of how it concentrates the power of those who would take advantage of such a state by elevating fear and distance between individuals. The Owl House shows an honest look at the complex relationships that adults have between each other and the children in their lives, by presenting a surprisingly large adult cast that showcases a wide variety of different ways to be an adult to the ultimate empowerment of its audience of all ages. Today, we'll be examining the good, the bad, mostly the messy, as we deep dive into the nature of these relationships and their implications. But before we jump back into the boiling aisles, let's first briefly talk about what adulthood, or what shapes our ideas about it, is.
Dead last chance, believing, racing into the night, and now we run wild. Yeah, now we run wild.
The definition of adulthood for most of human history has been a relatively fluid one, a mix of the arbitrary imposition of age or physical change in a person that gives them a legal status. These definitions, while socially useful, have also always excluded someone and have changed frequently, often while being defined by external circumstances. For example, in medieval Scandinavia, boys were considered legal adults around age 16. It's murkier for girls, but in Scandinavia and many cultures around the world, as soon as a person started menstruating, childhood, as it was known, was over, and that person was considered ready for marriage. Given that some people start menstruating at 12 or earlier, it's clear that attitudes about adulthood, childhood, and the ever-evolving science of adolescence have changed quite a bit since then. In modern times, Japanese people celebrate adulthood officially starting at age 20, while America has a number of arbitrary milestones that are the result of history and religion. Americans are legal adults at 18, but while they can vote, die in a war, and get married, they can't drink alcohol legally until 21. It's also important to note that this definition varies dramatically and brutally even in this modern age. One of my grandmothers was married at 15 in a place where that was normal at the time. Nowadays, we know this to not be great for a million reasons, but the point is that adulthood is a definition that changes as a society evolves and agrees to new ideas. They also go on to shape that particular age's sense of what is normal for an adult. For example, our most recent set of standards in the Western world, informed by an unprecedentedly wealthy economy, something resembling a social safety net, and strong social cohesion, was marked by a stable career, homeownership, marriage, and kids in the historically anomalous context of the nuclear family. However, while culturally this is still a norm people aspire to, none of the infrastructure to support this standard exists anymore. There is nothing to replace what's been bulldozed away, for better and for worse. The memory of these standards, however, leaves the people who have grown to adulthood in its shadow swimming awkwardly in a sea of ambiguous anxiety of, oh God, am I doing this right? Will I ever be a real adult? How can you know? Other than your parents and immediate family, what kind of adults, if any unrelated, do younger people have an opportunity to hang out with? There was once a time where intergenerational friendships weren't uncommon. Through stronger communities, knowing one's neighbors, volunteering, hobbies, getting out, if you will, younger people had opportunities to interact with and even befriend older people. Such relationships help both parties grow. For example, offering the younger person another vision of adulthood beyond the immediate family. Adults also benefit from these relationships by passing on knowledge and gaining experience from the lives of their younger cohorts. These kinds of relationships help people stay connected. That being said, these intergenerational friendships have become much rarer. Parents today live in a climate of terror, probably like never before, with stranger danger, a total lack of places for kids to hang out where they don't have to pay to be there. There are no more third spaces, a term coined by the urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg in the 1990s that can be summed up with this quote.
What suburbia cries for are the means for people to gather easily, inexpensively, regularly, and pleasurably. A place on the corner, real-life alternatives to television, easy escapes from the cabin fever of marriage and family life that do not necessitate getting into an automobile. Most needed are those third places, which lend a public balance to the increased privatization of home life. Third places are nothing more than informal public gathering places. The phrase third places derives from considering our homes to be the first places in our lives and our workplaces the second. The character of a third place is determined most of all by its regular clientele and is marked by a playful mood which contrasts with people's more serious involvement in other spheres. Though a radically different kind of setting for a home, the third place is remarkably similar to a good home in the psychological comfort and support that it extends. They are the heart of a community's social vitality, the grassroots of democracy, but sadly, they constitute a diminishing aspect of the American social landscape.
If you want more details on this fascinating concept, please go check out Andrewism's video on the topic, which I will link in the description. But for our purposes today, I bring them up because while not a lot of places fit the definition of a third place perfectly, spaces that are neutral ground where strangers mingle, where attendance is not obligated and people come to share mutual passions are deeply important to community. Places outside the strict family unit where people can come together as peers. Unrelated kids and adults rarely interact outside of specific tutelage-based environments, and interacting for fun or non-exchange mutual enjoyment is largely limited to fringe or small spaces like crafting fandom, hobbies, largely coordinated through the internet. And it is important to remember that on the internet we don't play the same social roles we play in person. Online, we are all peers. The suspicion and distrust of this sort of thing has gotten so poisonous that you have adults and minors alike genuinely asking if there is any non-predatory reason for an adult to be interacting with a minor. This is ludicrous. All social spaces carry some amount of risk, but it is an impoverished worldview that could lead one to the conclusion that no positive possibility exists within them. It is tempting to say that this question says a lot more about the person asking than anything else. It's probably more charitable and probably more true to say that it's simple ignorance and the climate of fear we live in that results in a person incapable of imagining a mutually beneficial, non-predatory relationship based in hobbies and mutual care. Point is, these relationships persist most strongly in fringe spaces. What this means is that more than ever, kids and young adults are growing up and entering a world of adulthood with only a very mythologized blueprint of what success means and a very limited suite of interactions scripted. There are definitely instances of this where we have younger people who tell 25-year-old women to get off the internet because shouldn't they be minding their children in the year of our Lord 2024. And while plenty of these can be interpreted as jokes, they do hint at an underlying and very real fear of essentially the inevitable. And it certainly does very little to make anyone happy. The only thing that could possibly dispel that is interactions with other adults, to provide proof of concept that one does not simply evaporate into irrelevance after an arbitrary age. That being said, we're living in an era where the traditional, although this definition is incredibly historically recent, markers of adulthood are absent due to a huge swath of complicated reasons that include war, economics, and environmental factors. What this does is represent the reality that there are many ways to be an adult and many ways to have relationship with kids, as well as the flip side that there are plenty of ways that adults can fail children and force the burden of adulthood onto them too early or in inappropriate ways. Maturity is separate from the concept of adulthood. All of this to say, adulthood and maturity are moving targets, and probably best shaped as a physically mature person who has had more time and hindsight to make mistakes. We hope that adults have care and stewardship towards younger peers, and have used their longer time on the planet to grow, accept responsibility, learn to sacrifice, and share and teach. But some haven't, and they are also inarguably adults. Rather than reducing adulthood to a class of people with greater power over the kids, the Owl House shows us adults as individuals, messy, imperfect ones, which begins to expand on that unspoken truth that a person's individuality doesn't evaporate when they turn 30. In addition, these adults exist in networks that don't exclusively revolve around their relationships with children. They have full, whole lives apart from them, so we get this important depth to their interactions. And this is extremely important for everyone watching. So with all that lengthy background, let's talk a bit about these adults and their relationships in greater detail. People always want the bad news first, so let's start with the worst of them.
I like your spirit, but try that again and things won't end well for you.
One of the most pervasive themes in the Owl House is willful ignorance. We talk about this in great detail with respect to Belos and Luce in a different video, but for today we'll be discussing how it informs the power dynamic of the shittiest adults in the show, and why this particular cut is so deep and noxious. Shitty adults will often tell children, "Oh, you are simply a child. You don't understand because you're too young to know." Over the course of my life, I have found that elders who say stuff like this have zero interest in remedying this ignorance. The longer, the less powerful person in the relationship, almost always someone younger, stays ignorant, the person with knowledge and experience maintains their power. What does this power actually mean, though? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot that the Owl House flays to the raw bone. It means the ability to do whatever you want without fear or expectation of a negative consequence, which is something that hypocritically levied at children is evidence of, well, childish behavior, because this is fundamentally a fantasy. This power dynamic, preserving a fantasy, isn't limited to adults and children. It can be leveraged in other kinds of relationships as well. But the Owl House is very damning about this. The knowledge of good and evil, after all, is what gives someone the freedom to make their own choices and experience consequences and become independent. And this is what the shitty adults in this show are desperate to prevent. If the people they desire power over learn, they will begin to lose control of them. Bellows leverages this en masse. He represents willful ignorance in himself and wherever he is. There is a cloak of lies obscuring the truth of everyone and everything. With the adults who serve him, he flatters and aggrandizes their egos, gives them opportunities to indulge their own fantasies of control, and even pits them against actual children to feed into their anxieties about their self-worth. While Bellows doesn't interact with a lot of the kids directly, he does have two important relationships with them, even though they're bad. Hunter is a non-entity. He's an object that Bellows delights in taking his impulses out on in the way a 4-year-old might destroy his toys or torture a cat. And Hunter is a toy he does lose interest in favor of tormenting Luce, a fellow human, whose opinions theoretically matter. In both cases, Bellows revels in a big lie about who and what he is in order to make these children feel small and himself superior. It's easy to seem big and powerful if you continually surround yourself with people who are, well, children or ignorant in some way. It's part of his myth of being greater and savvier than he actually is. He consistently ruins his own plans by choosing cruelty where any other option would have ensured success. Some quick examples include the drawn-out horror show of Hollow Mind, or the fact he took time out of his day to torment Luce, which gave her the upper hand in the season 2 finale. Although my favorite example is him kicking Kikimora after he already believes he's won the day, which ultimately unleashes the collector on his ass. This indulgent cruelty is what shapes a lot of the crappy adult relationships in this show. Bellows, Odalia, Terra, and Kikimora are all adults whose primary way of interacting with children is not cooperation or persuasion, but brute force. All of them prefer a world where their younger constituents, in a way, never grow up, because the transition to adulthood would represent independence for the children, upon whom their position of power is built. Odalia uses her financial and social power to brute force her kids into her image. Kikimora desperately feeds fear into the ear of a traumatized teen to nurture the insecurities that make her easy to manipulate. Terra Snapdragon uses her institutional authority as a teacher and adopts a mommy persona, to the end of creating no-win situations she contextualizes as measures of worth. Because she is in charge, what she says goes. It's a heady power trip, and one that is common from institutions like school, church, homeowners associations, and even Discord servers, where self-appointed fandom moms who should be mature adults who know better cultivate outrage in armies of 14-year-olds and send them to go burn visibly queer people who have opinions they don't happen to like to the ground, often while being queer themselves, and misconstruing outrage for morality and the ritual of a public execution of a scapegoat for justice. This, of course, is in stark contrast to adults like Ida, Camila, and even some of the messy ones like Darius or Alador, whose sense of power and self is not tied to someone else's subjugation. It's also not related to physical age. Bellows, for example, deliberately ensures that his closest lieutenants are two extremely childish adult women. Perhaps more kindly, both of these adult women are shown to be indoctrinated and high-ranking within the context of a cult. And cults are well known for strangling an individual's critical thinking and ensuring that they remain remain developmentally and emotionally delayed to the empowerment of the leader. It genuinely chilled me to see these kinds of adult relationships described in this show. They're not held up as standard, even though they're common. Everyone has had a brush with a vile, domineering, lie-peddling religious figure. They're on Fox News, in church, at Thanksgiving. Most people have encountered Odalia, financial abuser, an adult who views their child as a doll and the only acceptable form of growing up is turning into a mirror image of herself. It's unlikely you'll make it through school or youth group without meeting some version of Terra Snapdragon or Kikimora. But that, you might say. Lilith made a change. Are you really going to group her with Kikimora in terms of failures of adulthood? Well, Lilith and Kikimora, and the other uncomfortably realistic fools in this section, have a key difference that separate them. Lilith has both the ability and the desire to learn, not just from her peers, but from kids too. Lilith is brave enough to confront the willful ignorance she's wrapped around herself, admit she is wrong, and commit to improving, to making things right. And it's this assumption of responsibility for her actions and her successful follow-through that separates Bellows and company from everyone else here and their common, depressing real-world counterparts. And with that, it's now time to talk a little bit about imperfect, messy, and some of the most powerfully impactful adult representations in the Owl House. The ones who grow past the power fantasy and exist in recognition of that power.
Besides, us weirdos have to stick together, you know?
What does it mean to grow up exactly? For a lot of people, it means losing the innocence of ignorance and gaining awareness of responsibility, agency, and consequences for the actions we take or do not take. But another thing that plays a key part in defining it is in letting go of the fantasies that maintain the ignorance of one's own actions. Crucially, it's the ability to say, I know when I've made a mistake, and then take meaningful steps to learn from it. I feel like this is the key distinction between the approach to power adulthood grants a person in the assholes from the previous sections and the characters we're going to discuss in this one. We won't have time to cover everyone, but we will do our best to get through what I think are the tentpole characters that best represent this sliding scale of adulthood and maturity and comment on their connections to each other and the kids in their lives.
Good morning to you too, little prince.
We got a comment a while back asking if we were ever going to talk about Darius on this channel, and initially I was like, nah. Broadly speaking, he's most interesting between the lines, a character that great fanfic speculates on, and we try to focus more on the text in these essays. But he has become immediately relevant to the topic, so thank you Dariamaki81 and Kiralin Cassette. I want to start with Darius because all things considered, he could easily belong to the former category in the right light, but of all the characters we'll be discussing in this section, we know in the text the least about him. But the speculation of what's drawn is a goldmine of possibility. Darius is a coven head. As far as representing adulthood so far, he is an industry leader, someone whose power has meaningful consequences in terms of mobilizing and affecting others around him. I also think it's of some significance that Darius has all the traits of what might be considered a classic Disney villain, you know, back when Disney had actual villains, down to the sort of camp gay coding and the green-purple color scheme, especially since this does end up being a partial subversion. A partial subversion, you say? Well, isn't Darius a good guy, one might ask? Well, I feel like the answer is more complicated than that. Darius has climbed to the top of a truly horrible hierarchy. He has smothered what might be a better nature or willingness to engage with the reality of those choices. And I feel confident in saying that because this man truly becomes a character when we see him interact with a major kid character. Darius clearly resents Hunter for replacing his mentor, the previous Golden Guard, and he's grieving terribly after 16 years. He's callously blind to the impact of his words on Hunter here.
So, go play arts and crafts, or whatever it is you do.
Oh, looks like you've already started. This is impressively bad.
He indulges his own genuine cruelty at a kid who clearly wants nothing more than his approval in favor of his own grief, and he's done it for a while. He's been there since Hunter was sworn in at the very least, and there's no reason for him to take that grief out on a child. It's profoundly messed up for him to resent Hunter for basically existing and having the face of a dead loved one. But this is where it gets really interesting to me. The events of any sport in a storm force the consequences back into Darius's face. He can't continue to turn a blind eye to Hunter, the grief he's harboring, or his own participation justification in it because as much as it annoys him initially, he does recognize that he did, through apathy and callousness, put a bunch of unrelated kids in danger. But unlike the adults in Section 1, he not only recognizes this as his fault, but goes to lengths to fix it and protect those kids. And at no inconsiderable risk, he knows exactly what he's risking. Darius, like how Ida mentions in her fight with Lilith, has misused and wasted his power, and is now taking steps to bring it in line with the reality and consequences of those better instincts that he's been smothering. And the show makes no excuses for him. Was it wrong of him to treat Hunter the way he did? Was it wrong of him to make Hunter feel like he had to earn his trust the way it happened? Yeah, but after this point, Darius does take a parental interest in Hunter, and in what limited ways he can tries to offer support until the finale, where it's shown that he does try to step into this role. It could have been for time reasons that we didn't get a conversation where forgiveness was explicitly involved, but the understated nature of things leave it delightfully messy and complicated in a way that I feel resonates a bit more with the realities and pitfalls of adulthood. Bad coping mechanisms and letting actions describe that you are not only sorry, but able to grow too. Darius isn't simply good or bad, he's an adult showcasing a messy mix of both, but demonstrating a willingness to grow alongside and with the kids. Unfortunately, the vast majority of expansion on Darius' history and actions are limited to fanfic, and there are some really good ones out there. I will link my favorite in the description. But he remains to me a very compelling example of the complex depiction of adulthood in this show. Our next contestant, however, gives us a little more to work with.
Mittens! Didn't see you there.
Clearly.
There is something to be said for Odalia and Alador. On the one hand, we have a profoundly evil Pixar mom, and on the other, we have a guy who absolutely gives off battered spouse vibes. Normally, this is something worthy of unambiguous sympathy. But with Alador, as much as we might sympathize with the fact that he's clearly both checked out of his partnership with Odalia, he's pretty obviously checked out of everything else too. Everything about this character speaks to a deeply painful apathy. Towards himself, first and foremost, but we also see it towards his kids, even though Alador demonstrates that he's not only the technical expertise behind the blight industries, he's more observant than Odalia to the point of being able to execute on it. Unlike Odalia, who is fully given to her willful delusions and her ambitions, Alador is capable of observing facts. But so much of his behavior is hiding from the greater reality of his kids in favor of what must be easier when he's clearly so tired. But here's the thing. Alador is a neglectful parent and has abandoned his teenage children, now basically strangers, to protect himself emotionally from his miserable relationship and his life. This doesn't make him unsympathetic, where it might in other stories, and it's something I find really fascinating to be present in a show for kids, where this kind of thing is generally oversimplified. That's a complicated emotional cocktail, so much so that when he and Amity reach out towards each other, which is a huge reciprocal effort, Amity agreeing to start to get to know him again and refuse a hug is a huge win. Season 2, episode 14, Reaching Out, was a massive wake-up call for Alador, and bringing him back to the stage where he excelled in his youth, doing things he loved with his daughter, he does manage to realign himself to the reality of his situation, with great respect and care towards the kids he's failed up to this point. And in standing up for himself, he stands up for them. After that, even though he meets his heroic climax in resolving to die for Amity, he does grow back into himself again and gets to the joyful work of living. And it's worth mentioning that the Owl House doesn't leave the work of recovery to the imagination. Even if all they got was a montage to express it, every frame of this finale is showing you evidence and telling you a story of the work and effort that goes into starting from rock bottom. Looking at Alador where he was, middle-aged and depressed as hell, disconnected from his kids and totally apathetic towards life, and then having the courage to crawl out of it, to decide that he could. Maybe it's just because I'm caught between the kids' ages and the parents' ages in this show, but man, if you've been to rock bottom, you can empathize with that courage and what it costs to act on it. And the older we get, the more important I think it is that everyone, regardless of age, sees it.
Are you my mother? Because that is an awful lot of judgment.
I think Ida's specificity is one of the things that makes her easy to connect with. There is a funny line between appeal and specificity that I think good writers, especially those who hope to sell a story, either to an audience or an investor, must thread. And counter to what a marketing expert might say, what I've noticed broadly speaking is that characters who have specific appeal, idiosyncratic behaviors, and a mix of not necessarily attractive qualities are the ones that people connect to and love the most. All of their weirdness has more power because it resonates more closely with the experience of a weird, imperfectly non-optimized person, i.e., it's closer to the experience of being a real person. That power of portraying specificity has a generational impact. For example, many of the creators working on the Owl House grew up watching Full Metal Alchemist, and both Edward and Izumi Curtis are the types of characters that funnel inspiration into someone's mind. The kids who read it might now be adults with reproductive issues or disabilities themselves. Their perceptions of themselves and others has now broadened. It's with that in mind for both kids and adults that there is a powerful recognizability in Ida's idiosyncrasies as a character. The queerness, the disability, the gifted kid, the burned out adult, someone feared, someone disrespected, someone powerful in one realm and also broke, someone with an anguished love life, regrets, someone who gets to make significant growth in their recovery. So much of learning compassion comes from exposure. I plan on getting into this more than meets the eye topic in another video, but what's critical about Ida is that she may be someone's very first look into the reality that an adult, a person old enough to be a parent, can struggle, need medicine and support. And Ida, like the kids, gets to experience maturing events throughout her story. These events include when she humbled herself and had an uncomfortable conversation with the kid she took responsibility for. They include owning up to her wasted and irresponsible uses of power, the ability to be taught, letting go of old guilt to reconcile with an elderly parent, and probably most heroic in the eye of this bat, accepted, made peace, and learned to live with her condition. But the thing that really got to me, as far as adulthood, fantasies, and maturing goes, was Ida, Lilith, and their mother. Ida and Lilith are middle-aged women. Lilith, in particular, is starved for parental attention, and I was boggled that the show actually discussed how this unsatisfied need wounded her. And it wasn't a punchline. Not really. Gwendolyn is elderly, and lots of kids shows get into the relationship between children and their parents. Lots of shows dig into the feelings of being unheard, unseen, or underappreciated. It's that difference between a fantasy and a reality made tense by a parent-child dynamic, where sometimes a parent fails to understand a child because the problem the parent wants them to have is different from the one they actually have. But truly, I don't think a show for kids this young on this scale has ever presented the possibility of adult children weeping into their elderly mother's arms for the same reasons that young kids cry to their mothers. And mothers, perhaps most cathartically of all, apologizing. Apologizing for their best, which wasn't enough at the time. And when you are a parent, that might be one of the most bittersweet things about the maturing event. It's in that vein of bittersweet victories that we're going to talk about the most prominent parent in this show, Camila Noceda.
I had a hard time growing up. I was afraid you would too.
Camila, in my eyes, is a genuine superhero. She's a widow, she works a full-time job, she's raising a neurodivergent child alone, and has to balance her own bereavement with her traumatized kid's grief. Camila's lack of conformity resulted in, by her own admission, a hard time growing up. Her nerdy interests, fandom participation, and offbeat sense of humor are implied to have alienated her from her peers. Seeing these same traits in Luz, on top of her child's traumatic grief over losing her father, naturally led Camila to fear for her daughter's happiness and future. So she acts to try and spare Luz additional pain, but in doing so alienates her further by leading Luz to believe that those things that make her who she is make her so incompatible with the world around her she can never belong or be understood. I think it's interesting that even though I think any sane person would nominate Camila for Mother of the Year any day, Camila kinda does lose her daughter. Now, hear me out. There is a big part of growing up where one establishes oneself outside of a parent. But there's also the inevitable transition of a parent whose child matures. There is a letting go in that experience. But for Camila, she failed to give her daughter what she needed. But messing up is part of living, as she herself admits. Even so, Luz had to go elsewhere to get what she needed before she could return to her birth mother. Camila was able to give all of those other kids exactly what it was they needed from an adult in their lives, except Luz herself. The text doesn't go too deep into this, but in thinking a lot about Camila, I can't help but see the crazy amount of growing she does between formally taking V in and the end of the show. And it's Camila's admission that she made a mistake in trying to change this powerful good witch into something she's not, that Luz needed to hear more than any other secret in the entire story. Finally, Camila is an immigrant. There is an understated narrative here of coming to a new place and settling, leaving behind where your grandparents live, your parents, watching your child go elsewhere, watching your child become someone bigger than you ever dreamed them to be in a place you didn't know you had prepared them for, in a place you couldn't have prepared them for. Loving someone enough to let them go and let things change is probably one of the hardest things in adulthood. But here's a thing that I couldn't have known until I got here that has stuck with me ever since. Adulthood and maturity is about constant change.
Great work, everyone. Muy bueno.
As I was getting through college, particularly as my illness started to get worse, I remember that people would often try to comfort me by insisting I was going through a transitional phase. But we experience time linearly, and as much as I as a person tend to be super wary of change, the passage of time for humans is inevitable. For as long as I've lived, I've never known myself to not be in a stage of transition. Some change is marked by the physical, but the boundaries of what we think of as child and adult have always been murky. Was I an adult at age 10 when I got huge boobs in a period basically overnight? Was I an adult at 18 deciding from a sickbed the decisions that would change my life forever with zero hindsight? Was I mature when I was 22 and I started learning the mechanical process of letting go and being wrong? During any of that time, did things ever stop changing? Did I ever stop learning that the older I got, the more I realized I don't know? Did I become an adult when I started mentoring kids myself and asking them to clarify slang terms for me? I remember reading somewhere that around age 30 that the generational drift starts to set in. People around that age statistically stop listening to new music or paying attention to what their kids are into. For my part, I have to actively try not to let that happen, in order that I never forget what it's like to be a kid, but also so that I don't end up falling prey to the tempting fantasies of a world that never changes. Of a world where I am always right, or can avoid an uncomfortable truth that maybe something about me needs to grow and change again. I feel like with all of that said, there is no point where adults need to stop growing or maturing, where the transition ever really stops. It's exactly why I want to end this video by talking about Steve. I want to include him because while not exactly an everyman, I do think his inclusion is important. Genuinely, Steve is a familiar adult. He's a friend, he's a co-worker, someone who lived in a messed up world and excelled at a miserable, extractive job that did a real number on his identity. Someone who got out, who went to therapy, got humble and took ownership of what he's done. With that, he used what power and agency he has to do what he can. And as it turns out, he can do a lot, and I bet it's more than he ever thought possible. Truly, Steve, minor meme character, carries the theme of restorative change, learning, and power, a theme of maturing, something you don't have to be a kid to do. I really love that the Owl House depicts a mutual maturing process for both kids and adults. Our heroes don't stop learning, and this portrayal of an uncertain, ever-changing adulthood reminds both kid and adult viewers that we as people are always growing and changing, no matter how old we get. We always need each other to make changes in our world. And as often as things change, these storied reminders are always welcome and needed. Thank you all so much for joining us, and a shout out to all of you watching live. I'd love to hear about what you, the viewers, thought about adulthood in the Owl House as a theme. I know there were plenty of characters I didn't get to, so if you have your own thoughts on characters mentioned or unmentioned, please let us know in the comments. We recently broke 14,000 subscribers and passed our 1-year anniversary. It is through your enjoyment of our work that we've decided to look into growing the channel even more, to free up the team to bring you more of, well, everything. So if you love our work, please consider supporting us over at Patreon, where you will have access to behind-the-scenes snippets, outtakes, squeakless versions of our uploads, and videos otherwise too forbidden for YouTube. Thank you all from the bottom of our little hearts, and we'll see you all in the next one. Free!